Welcome to the final lecture on the Chronicles of Narnia, the final lecture for now, in which we draw some conclusions and make some finishing remarks, concluding remarks. The Chronicles of Narnia, Recapitulation. At the outset of this lecture series, I said that there were three questions that were to be saved to the very end. One was the question about composition, and one was the question about occasion, why were they published, when they were published, and the final one was the question about reception. Why have they become so popular? So we're going to tackle these questions today. However, as for the first one, composition, it's kind of already answered in the previous lectures. According to Ward, if you followed the argument so far, the burden of proof is now on the retractors of this planetary theory. Much evidence has been marshaled, persuasive in his opinion. Now, if you want to disagree, it is up to you to disprove the theory, which stands on its merits. As for the problem of occasion, Ward has a less confident proposal. Basically, the proposal is this. The debate between C.S. Lewis and Elizabeth Anscombe at the Oxford Socratic Club about the self-contradictoriness of naturalism might explain the conception and the occasion of the Chronicles of Narnia series. Narnia is an imaginative response and reaction to this debate, but not necessarily in the way it has sometimes been portrayed. In short, the mental images that he had since he was 16 of a fawn with an umbrella, a queen and a sledge, a magnificent lion, these were, Ward says, the first Chronicles ovum. And the debate with Elizabeth Anscombe then fertilized it. The lion he began writing The Lion the same year, 1948, in which he debated Elizabeth Anscombe when she was 29 years old. According to A.N. Wilson, one of Lewis's biographers, Lewis was so stung by this debate that he retreated into children's literature. Ward says that Narnia is indeed a response to this debate, a response rather than a retreat from the critique posed by Anscombe. Wilson's argument is elitist, it's a non sequitur, and it begs the question, is children's literature really juvenile? According to Ward, this is a popular misconception, and it's actually a temporary historical accident, not shared by later generations, for example. The second motive that Ward proposes for writing this series is that composing it was kind of a therapeutic project. Already in 1916, Lewis had written to his friend Arthur, "Whenever you are fed up with life, start writing. Ink is the great cure for all human life." And the third motive would be religious. What does God want from me now, here? In Anscombe's memory, the debate was friendly and charitable, much more even than Wilson portrays. Anscombe's portrayal of the debate does not support Wilson. The occasion, according to Anscombe, was sober, and dismissals of Lewis's performance or reaction, according to Anscombe, are a projection. Afterwards, the two had lunch together. She commends Lewis's rewriting of the book Miracles, the subject of their debate, as this showed Lewis's honesty and seriousness, said Anscombe, as a philosopher. Wilson never mentions this second edition of Miracles, which Lewis edited in response to the debate. We don't know why Wilson never mentions it, so it's probably just an oversight. Well, what was the debate about in the first place? We don't need to rehearse the content in detail here. In short, it was a narrow critique of certain paragraphs in chapter 3 about theories and causation, or theories of causation, in the book Miracles. The summary of the main argument, which Lewis continued to defend in both editions of the book, is that human reason points to a supernatural origin. Human reason participates in divine logos, and naturalism as a philosophical worldview defeats itself. Lewis quotes Haldane, "If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." Human thought is not God's, but God-kindled, wrote Lewis. If, according to Descartes, I think, therefore I am, Lewis, in a way, reverses it. I am, therefore I think, meaning because divine logos exists, I am able to think. Owen Barfield called this participatory knowledge. We must remember this is not Lewis's full theological anthropology view of the human person. Reason is just a part of Imago Dei, the image of God. Reason is not Imago Dei itself. The human will and imagination, for example, are also important, as is love, obviously, if God is love and we are created in God's image. But reason is one important signpost, a kind of miracle that requires a supernatural explanation. Morality itself is another such miracle. As we discussed in an earlier lecture, outrage of crooked depends on straight. The problem of evil is only arises because of our bias in favor of good. And where do we get that bias? The book Miracles' full argument is that this cosmos irradiated by kindling of divine reason, but not just that, also the kindler himself, according to Ward, has entered the cosmos. Just like divine logos, which is a supernatural thing, could be united with a human person, which is a natural thing, in the mind of every human thinker, so it's no surprise that God, as the supernatural creator, could be united with a person, the human Jesus. Lewis was both a rational and an imaginative thinker. The debate did not lead to a retreat from apologetics, but he sought ways to explain his case imaginatively as well. As soon as he could, he would make a brief intellectual adjustment to his argument, which was published in the Socratic Digest, but it took 12 years for it to be incorporated into the second edition of Miracles when it was republished. According to Ward, the change is not from something complex to something simpler, but vice versa, something quite narrow to something more fulsome. Whereas the Miracles argued that the human mind is illuminated by divine reason, the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe shows, demonstrates that it is illuminated by divine reason, as represented by Jupiter. The book begins with literally children in the dark, but also metaphorically. Said Susan suddenly, and everyone asked her what was the matter. I'm sitting against a tree, said Susan, and look, it's getting light over there. By Jove, you're right, said Peter. And look, there and there, it's trees all around. And this wet stuff is snow. Why, I do believe we've got into Lucy's wood after all. And this is Ward. Peter's by Jove sounds like a casual expression. It is. It has a very different meaning from Ransom's by Jove at the beginning of Perelandra. Ransom, both as a philologist and interplanetary traveler, knew the significance of what he was saying. Peter does not. For him, by Jove is an empty metaphor. He does not recognize that in the Narnian world that he has just entered, it is indeed by Jove, Jove properly understood as the enjoyable mask of God in this story, that he's able to see light and know it as such. However, although Peter has no savoir knowledge of Jove, his connaître knowledge is already beginning to operate. His soul, spirit sense 1, and his reason, spirit sense 2, are sufficiently in tune with this jovial world for him to ask Lucy to lead the way, to trust the red-breasted robin, and accept the help of the beavers. When he hears the name of Aslan, his spirit, sense 3, comes alive and rejoices. He feels suddenly brave and adventurous. He discovers a contemplatable version of Jove, an incarnation of Jupiter in the form of the kingly lion. Edmund resembles the naturalist skepticism, before his rescue at least. The book The Lion is a large metaphor, says Ward, for the human situation vis-a-vis reason and the divine reasoner. Readers participate in the story, which is imaginatively the equivalent of the argument in Miracles. They enjoy in fiction visions of a world Lewis contemplated in his rational apologetics. The debate with Anscombe reminded Lewis of the deficiency of all apologetics, of all intellectual defense of the Christian faith, of rational argument in favor of anything. By nature, rational arguments are never able to convey the concrete reality, give you the taste behind spiritual experience. And Lewis was humbled by this debate. He was reminded of these things because he already knew. As he says in his famous poem, The Apologist's Evening Prayer, "From all my lame defeats, and oh so much more, from all the victories that I seem to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which, while angels weep, the audience laugh, from all my proofs of thy divinity, thou who wouldst give no sign, deliver me. Thoughts are but coins, let me not trust instead of thee their thin-worn image of thy head. From all my thoughts, even from my thoughts of thee, O thou fair silence, fall and set me free. Lord of the narrow gate and the needle's eye, take from me all my trumpery, lest I die." Deliver from cleverness and a fair silence are woven into Narnia, according to Ward. And this provides an answer to the problem of occasion. Why were they written when they were written? But it also possibly helps to understand more than that. It helps to understand why Lewis started with Jupiter, which was his favorite. The lion comes first, is the first example of an idea he wanted to try out, as he says in one letter. Mars and Sol follow naturally because of their intimate connection to the merits of the Alexander technique, the looking along, looking at, contemplation versus enjoyment technique. In Mars, you look along chivalry and obviously the light beam itself. In one letter to a boy, Lewis said that even after having written The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he had not yet decided on 7. But sometime after The Horse and His Boy, he decides to treat all 7 planets. And then the idea is worked out to the full. What about the problem of reception? Why, given all the problems, did the book become so popular in the end? Some 3.5 million copies of The Lion, Witch in the Wardrobe alone is published or sold annually in some 33 languages or so. And the readership is very diverse and consistently diverse, boys and girls, children and adults, the simple and the learned. What could explain this vast, expansive popularity and reach? The problem is kind of answered by the earlier solutions. For if planets have permanent value as spiritual symbols, as Lewis thought they did, it's no surprise that they would become popular. And this would have more explanatory power than Wilson's theory of retreat or Tolkien's theory of hodgepodge. But for 50 years, this origin, the Socratic club origin of the planetary scheme has gone unnoticed. Really? According to Ward, this is irrelevant because they have been doing their magic all along, which is most important. Lewis is here following George MacDonald, who said, "It is not the things we see the most clearly that influence us the most powerfully." The human person might be usefully pictured in 3 concentric circles, with the human will as the inner ring and the reason as the middle ring, and imagination as the outer ring. The first step to addressing the whole person would be to successfully and powerfully communicate with the outer ring, that is the organ of meaning of things. The meaning of things, which is a requirement to assess their truth value to begin with, let alone any point of action, which is the natural habitat of the will. So the two-part answer to the problem of reception would be, first, about the imaginative reception of the arguments in miracles. The Pevensies, the children, are able to think, know, and reason because they are supported by a jovial logos which permeates the Narnian universe. And so on with the martial logos, the solar logos, and so on. Reason, spirit, sense 1, soul, spirit, sense 2, and in due course, novitas, spirit, sense 3, are affected by the presiding planetary power as symbols of Christ. The planetary symbols nourish their conscious existence on all of these levels. And they don't see it because it's so near. They almost breathe it, just like Puddleglum in the maze. They're too close to it. In miracles, Lewis says that the supernatural reality is so often forgotten because it is so near and so obvious. Think of the images of clean windows or one's native grammar or breathing, all so natural. Ward writes, clean windows, mother tongues, and healthy lungs do not draw attention to themselves. They're easily overlooked and deemed unimportant. Lewis quotes Aristotle, for as bats' eyes are to daylight, that is, they're blind, so our intellectual eye to those truths which are in their own nature the most obvious of all. There's a saying in academic circles that the more obvious the truth, the more difficult it is to find a source for it. The apparent hiddenness of God is a leitmotif in other books as well, as we've discussed, The Problem of Pain, Letters to Malcolm, Till We Have Faces, of course, and so on. This is a major feature of Lewis's spirituality, that to exercise enjoyment consciousness, so looking along things, to experience divine hiddenness or hidden divinity, the faculty of contemplation. And coming to know God is not like learning a new subject than it is breathing a new atmosphere. Perhaps my takeaway here would be that faith as a virtue is the virtue of seeing and remembering the obvious. So this would be the first of the two-part answer to the problem of reception. The Chronicles were successful because readers sensed that Narnia presents a vision of human life which is lived in harmony with the spiritual realm, even though this is never directly argued as it is in miracles. And then turning to the imaginative reception of the characters of the planets themselves. In The Discarded Image, Lewis spoke of the planets conceptually, but he wanted more, says Ward. He didn't just want to transmit information. We need to know them, not just know about them. Connaître, not savoir. Elsewhere, he writes, the arts depend on turning savoir into connaître as far as possible. In the poem The Planets and in the Ransom trilogy, Lewis discusses or deals with the planets semi-conceptually or semi-imaginatively. These are a midpoint between pure contemplation, looking at, and pure enjoyment, looking along. But so goes Ward's argument. In the Chronicles of Narnia, the planets are dealt with imaginatively, through and through. And this would work as a summary of Planet Narnia. The Christological figure of Aslan locates and focuses, in other words, makes contemplatable the personality of the presiding planetary spirit, otherwise only enjoyable by the characters and the readers. Venus and Saturn have been most or remain most successful in modern imagination. The other planets are dying slowly. Lewis writes, the work of Jung and Freud and the practice of many modern poets and prose writers has taught us that symbols are the natural speech of the soul, a language older and more universal than words. As astrological archetypes, the 7 planets are permanent spiritual symbols which have permanent spiritual value. They're archetypes, which means that they're foundational symbols that recur in cultures across time. For example, our Superman and the Hercules for the ancients share the same archetype. Our Marilyn Monroe or some other fertile sex bomb and Aphrodite are rooted in the same archetype, and so on. And this is the second part of the 2-part answer to the problem of reception. Lewis's readers are fed a diet that is appealing to long established and deeply felt appetites in the human imagination. Narnia addresses universal cravings of imagination. Did you spot the final fallacy? Was there a fallacy? Which one was it of the remaining ones, and where was it? Thank you.